everyone. Welcome to the Week 7 lecture for Crim 210. The last lecture on psychopathy went on a little long, so I'll make this lecture a little bit shorter, a little bit sweeter, and today we're going to be focusing on the nature and extent of youth crime. So we'll talk first a little bit about where we get our information about youth crime, and we can break it down into three sources. We'll talk about the media, we'll talk about official statistics, and then we'll talk about self-report and victimization surveys. The media is probably where most people get their information on crime from, and there's a very big discrepancy between how information on crime is communicated in Canada versus in the United States. I think big reason for this is that, especially in Canada with CBC, it's a not-for-profit news station, and so entertainment isn't necessarily first and foremost on this company's mind, whereas in the United States, it doesn't matter which channel you're on, these news stations tend to be for-profit. And it can be really interesting watching news in the United States in terms of how they present crime information, because they try to sensationalize it to a real extreme. You've got people like Nancy Grace who will basically be paid to sensationalize crime. So this is what can contribute to a greater level of fear of crime in the United States. Another interesting element of the United States is that sheriffs and judges tend to be elected by the people, by citizens, as opposed to political parties or where sheriffs will be hired by police departments. In the United States, sheriffs get elected, and you can watch on TV commercials by judges advocating how the opponent that they're running against sentenced an individual to only 35 years in custody and therefore they're soft on crime. So it's a very different dynamic compared to here in Canada, where we still see a little bit of sensationalization. We can still see some issues with inaccurate reporting due to a poor understanding of the justice system. We'll talk about this at the very end of the class. But most people are not actually going out and collecting data or reading research. They get their sources of information about crime from the media. When the media describes what's going on about youth crime, sometimes they'll refer to official statistics. And we get our official statistics on crime from three major sources: police, courts, and corrections. When we're looking at police data, we tend to get information about the rate of arrests. When we're looking at the courts, we tend to get information about the rate of convictions. When we're looking at corrections, we get more details about what percent of individuals are actually sentenced to custody. These official statistics help us get a sense of, because police are the gatekeepers to the justice system, this is why we will see higher arrest rates compared to higher charge rates and higher sentencing rates. Courts tend to reflect charge rates, and we would see higher charge rates compared to higher sentence rates that are maybe more typical of correctional statistics. And this is because not all persons that are charged are convicted, but all persons that are convicted have to have been charged and have to have been arrested. And as we'll see in this class, when we look at the rate of crime over time amongst youth in Canada, we've tended to see over the last 20-30 years fairly steady declines in the rate of offending, which often kind of contradicts sometimes how the media tends to portray youth crime. The third source that we'll look at is from researchers, and researchers can provide information on self-report data on offending and victimization surveys. Self-reported offending data refer to instances in which, for example, I would go into the Burnaby Youth Custody Center, and when interviewing youth, I would ask these individuals about crimes that they have committed in the past, including crimes that maybe they did not get caught for. So this helps us identify which crimes individuals are committing but escaping punishment. A question that students might have reflects whether they think that youth would be truthful in talking about crimes that they committed but were not detected for. And what's really important in research, and I kind of alluded to it last week when talking about interview strategy skills, is that our interviews are confidential, meaning if the individual self-reported to me that they had committed a homicide offense and got away with it, that's information that I would have to keep confidential. We can do the same thing with victimization surveys, where instead of asking about times in which an individual perpetrated an offense, we can ask about times that they've experienced victimization. Part of the problem with looking at victimization surveys is that they won't capture all crimes because sometimes there are victimless crimes. These three sources of information on offending, so from the media, from official statistics, and from researchers, are associated with different strengths and weaknesses, and we can break these down into validity issues and reliability issues. Validity issues speak to how well we're actually measuring what we propose to measure. So for example, official data might not be great at measuring crime. The reason being is that official data rely on the fact that the individual has been detected by some agent of the justice system, whether it's the police, the courts, or corrections. But a lot of crime does not get detected by the justice system, especially in terms of actually identifying a suspect. And so official data on crime are always going to underestimate the rate of offending in the population. This is what we refer to as the dark figure of crime. Offenses that are not captured by official statistics. This is where self-report surveys and victimization surveys can be really useful because, as I mentioned, we can ask individuals about crimes that they committed that maybe they did not get detected for, or instances in which they experienced victimization, but the police were not able to identify a suspect or arrest that suspect. On the other hand, official data tend to be very reliable. Reliability refers to the extent to which the research results can be replicated in other studies. A useful way of thinking about validity and reliability is to think about a bathroom scale. If we step on a scale and we know for a fact that our weight is 155 pounds. 155 pounds, and then they step on this new scale and they're 155 pounds. We know that that scale is valid. It's capturing the same construct that we're trying to measure, which is weight. Another question is, will we be able to measure that weight reliably? And what this means is if they step on and off the scale half a dozen times, will they continue to equal 155 pounds? So can we replicate that value? Even if we set the scale ahead, so let's say we added 5 pounds to the scale, we would expect them to step on the scale and each time they would weigh 160 pounds. So that's the difference sort of between reliability and validity. Reliability is the ability to get that measurement over and over and over again. The reason why official data are really good at being reliable is because police, courts, and corrections are required to do things like record every time an arrest is made, identify the individual's name, the date, the time, when it happened, where it happened, and so on. When we look at self-report data, individuals aren't necessarily creating like a Dear Diary, today at 7:59 p.m. I committed a bank robbery. They're not recording that level of detail. So we can get two issues with reliability. One is that maybe the individual is going to lie about crime, so maybe they underestimate the amount of crime they've committed, or they want to sound very hardcore, so they overestimate the amount of crime they've committed. Or we could have an issue with telescoping. Basically, it's a situation where the individual reports the right event, but in the wrong time period. Let's say if I was asking a participant if they've ever committed a robbery in the last 6 months, and they answer yes. However, in reality, the robbery that they committed occurred 8 months ago, so they're not lying, they're reporting the right event, but they're just misremembering when it actually occurred. The further back we ask participants to remember, the more likely we are to have issues with telescoping. If you ask a 40-year-old to try and recall the crimes that they committed when they were 15, it's much more likely to be inaccurate or unreliable compared to asking a 16-year-old to recall crimes they committed at age 15. This is why longitudinal research is very important. We don't want to wait till somebody is 40 years old to ask them about crimes at 15. We want to interview them at 16 and ask about the past year, and at 40 ask about the past year. When it comes to the characteristics of those three sources that I began the class talking about, media, definitely the most widely available or at least easily accessible. The most reliable would be official data, and the most valid would be self-report and victimization surveys. Just to reiterate, for official reports, they tend to be highly reliable because it's easy to record the number of arrests, charges or convictions of a person. But with the dark figure of crime, we might have certain types of crime less likely to be detected. Or if we have biases within the justice system, we might know that certain individuals are more likely to be targeted by police or by the courts or by corrections. And so those individuals may be overrepresented in official statistics, whereas other individuals are underrepresented. For example, if we have a kid in West Vancouver or Shaughnessy or something like that, and they commit a break and enter, maybe the police officer is going to simply take the individual home and ask their parents to deal with the problem. But if we're looking at the downtown east side, East Vancouver, New West, Surrey, maybe we're going to have individuals who are more likely or less likely to be white, less likely to be affluent, and maybe police are going to target them in a different way and take them to jail, take them into custody, as opposed to having parents deal with this particular offense. A really serious issue with official reports is when we rely on UCR-based data, and not all official statistics rely on UCR data. The official statistics I use don't do this, but UCR data only focuses on the most serious offense. So if an individual goes on a crime spree and in one night let's say they get drunk and they steal a car. So now they've committed motor vehicle theft, but also drinking and driving. And then after they've stolen the car, they're detected by police and they get in a high-speed chase. So now they are not just stealing a car, but they could be charged with dangerous driving, and they could be charged with like willfully resisting or obstructing a police officer. And during that drive, maybe they run over a stop sign, so now we've got vandalism or property damage as well. Ultimately, we've talked about like 6 or 7 different offenses, but the UCR definition is only going to look at the motor vehicle theft offense because that was the most serious. So we're always underestimating the amount of crime that's actually occurring. Victimization surveys help us address the dark figure of crime because they deal with offenses that are not detected by police. We can get issues with reporting biases or issues with telescoping with victimization surveys. And we also, as I mentioned, have difficulty addressing that idea of victimless crimes. What happens if we want to know about drug trafficking? Like, technically speaking, we could say that society is a victim of drug trafficking, but we can't really identify a specific victim, so it's somewhat harder to measure. We can address this with self-report studies, where we can identify different crime types and ask individuals if they have ever perpetrated these crime types. One of the issues could be that sometimes not possible or feasible to ask participants about every single possible crime type. And crime types evolve over time. So in the 1970s and 80s, probably very few, if any, questions about committing cyber-based offenses, whereas now things like swatting can be more important to think about when building self-report surveys. Self-report surveys therefore help deal with the dark figure of crime and victimless crimes, but they might not be very effective when it comes to trying to measure the prevalence of particularly serious or stigmatizing crimes. I'm especially thinking about sexual offenses. When I would interview youth that have committed sexual offenses, they would virtually always lie. I would say like maybe 60% of kids that I would interview would lie to me when I would ask them about their history of prior sexual offending. Even if it said so on their court record, and I would ask them about it, they would say, no, I've never committed a sexual offense. And of those like 60% of kids that would lie about committing a sexual offense, even if they were convicted of that offense, even if I would follow up with them and I would say, well, look, I've looked at your criminal records and I know that you have a sexual offense. I'd like to remind you that I'm in a non-judgmental position and the survey is confidential, so you don't have to worry about me reporting this information to anybody else. Is there anything you would like to do to change your answer or respond to that question in a different way? I'd say about another like 15 to 20% of participants would still lie at least once after me giving them that opportunity to correct their answer. Why I'm saying this is because we can underestimate the prevalence of certain crimes like sexual offenses if we rely on these self-report interviews. self-report studies are maybe especially prone to the issue of telescoping, and especially when we're dealing with individuals that have perpetrated a lot of crimes, because they might have even more difficulty recalling when certain crimes did or did not occur. I'm fully aware that this is not the most exciting class or the most exciting lecture topic, but I think it's really important to understand the state of youth crime in Canada. So we do need to take a look at crime trends and see what has been happening over the last 30-40 years in terms of the rate of offending, the severity of offending amongst youth in Canada. Criminology is not a natural science, so rarely do we ever get to have core facts that are universally true. But one of these core facts is the age crime curve, which depicts at the aggregate level the number of crimes committed per 100,000 people at each year of age. So what this age crime curve shows is that at around age 15, 16, 17, we see the rate of offending within the general population peak. So the highest rate of offending is when individuals are around 16 or 17 years old, and then we see a swift decline thereafter. This does not mean that youth account for more crime than adults. In fact, adults are actually account for maybe like 75–80% of all crime. But that's because there are more adults than teenagers. All this age crime curve means is that at age 16, we're much more likely to see a population of 16-year-olds include individuals that engage in crime compared to if we were looking at a population of 20-year-olds or a population of 30-year-olds. Another critical point is that not all offenders follow the age crime curve. So remember that the age crime curve describes an aggregate trajectory. Recall from a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Terry Moffat's work especially, and she distinguished between AL and LCP offending as two different age crime curves, that most individuals are showing that AL pattern that does resemble kind of the aggregate age crime curve, but she also said there was a small group of individuals associated with life course persistent offending. And we find that in Canada, or at least in British Columbia, amongst serious and violent youth, this is also true. There are multiple different patterns or trajectories of offending over time. You can see in the lower graph here showing the colored trajectories between ages 12 to 23, and on the y-axis you can see the number of different convictions. You can see different patterns of conviction trajectories for a sample of formerly incarcerated boys and girls. Some of these individuals do kind of follow the age crime curve, where some individuals show more of a persistent pattern of offending over time. So the key here is that not all individuals follow that age crime curve. It's an aggregate description, but it doesn't mean that all individuals follow that same pattern. When it comes to youth crime rates in Canada, we can see that especially since the late 1980s, early 1990s, total youth crime in Canada has been dropping, and this is also true of property crimes and to maybe a lesser extent violent crimes. Part of the reason why we don't see as big of a decline in violent crimes on this particular graph compared to total crimes or property crimes, because violent crime isn't that prevalent to begin with. So it's more difficult on this scale to see an actual big decline in violent crime. In the 1990s, James DiLeo developed this idea that there was the youth super predator, and that by the mid-1990s, early 2000s, there were going to be tens of thousands of youth in the United States who were these quote-unquote psychopaths, murderers, callous and unemotional, gang involved, and they were going to be roaming the streets and crime would be out of control. And this was totally wrong. It was a complete fabrication, not a fabrication, but he was just wildly inaccurate and did a lot of harm to a lot of young kids who got labeled as these super predators. This was more so in the United States, but because Canada tends to spend a lot of time focusing on media in the United States, these ideas or opinions were somewhat adopted in Canada as well, and we thought that we needed to have this really get tough on crime approach to curb the youth super predator. In reality, we did not see an increase in youth crime. In fact, we have seen over the last several decades declines in the youth crime rate. I first started interviewing kids in the youth custody centers throughout British Columbia around 2008, 2009. And at that time, in the Burnaby Youth Custody Center, there were about 110, 120 residents. Today, there's like 10, 13. So we've seen a massive decline in the rate of youth being sentenced to custody in British Columbia. Some might suggest, well, maybe the youth crime rate is going down, but what about more serious offenses? Is it possible that youth are committing more serious crimes? Or even, is it possible that youth are committing really serious crimes and we're placing them in custody for a long period of time, and that has been effective in reducing the crime rate? So by incarcerating kids for a longer period of time, we've managed to reduce the crime rate. So one way of evaluating this is looking at the crime severity index, which basically calculates the average length of time an individual would receive had they committed a particular crime type. What we can see, again, since around the late 1990s, early 1990s, is that crime has dropped in severity over time. We've seen some upticks since 2014, but that's almost more like regression to the mean. We've seen an uptick, but it hasn't surpassed the levels that we saw in the late 1990s. What I think we can say confidently is that crime has declined in Canada, and it has not gotten more severe either. These earlier graphs were looking at police data, but what about court cases? The rate of youth that end up in court is on the decline, and we can see a little bit of this having to do with the initiation or enactment of the YCJA, which was initiated in 2002 but came into effect in 2003. And you can see between 2002 and 2003, that's when we saw a really major decline in court cases, because the YCJA recognized that maybe dealing with first-time young offenders through the court system is not the right way to go. Maybe this can create negative labels, and that could influence continued offending over time. We'll talk about legislation more next week, but just wanted to point out that especially because of legislative changes, we have seen changes in the crime rates, especially when looking at court cases. This is a very interesting graph right here. What it's showing is custody sentences among those going to court. So it's showing that among those individuals who do end up in court, the rate of such individuals that receive a custody sentence is decreasing. So it's showing not just that the crime rate is decreasing in general, and thus reflects fewer custody cases, showing that among the active offender population, custody is less likely. We're seeing kids end up in court, but yet being less likely to actually receive a custody sentence. What I'm trying to communicate here is that it's not just that youth crime in Canada is on the decline, and therefore custody sentences are on the decline, which we kind of naturally expect. It's also saying that when we do have youth in court, currently, as opposed to in the last couple of decades, we're less likely to see those youth court cases result in a custody sentence. So it has nothing to do with differences in the number of youth that end up in court. What it's saying is that the rate of youth in court is, even if it remained the same over time, the difference that we're seeing is the number of youth, or the rate of youth, that end up in youth custody. Some very interesting research was done during the Young Offenders Act, so pre-YCJ. Interviews with youth court judges under the YOA showed that judges very often use deterrence to justify a custody sentence for the young person. So they would say to the young person, we're going to place you in custody so that you learn that what you have done is wrong and you'll get punished for it, and that's going to deter you from offending in the future. We've learned over time that deterrence is actually really ineffective in reducing future offending. People like the idea of deterrence, and they think that that is going to help protect victims, and I really take issue with this because it actually doesn't help protect future victims. My goal as a criminologist is to reduce harm. I think a really big issue is that it's very easy for people to have an opinion on crime. You can sit around a dinner table and everyone can have an opinion on what should be done about a particular person who's committed an offense. And very often you're going to say or hear people say that we need to put that person in jail so they won't commit a crime like that in the future. And that might be well intended, but the reality is that custody sentences tend to not actually deter individuals from reoffending in the future. If your goal is to prevent harm, if you want to prevent people from experiencing victimization, then you probably don't want to advocate for deterrence. The problem is that deterrence becomes very politicized, and so people will look at the idea of deterrence very ideologically. My opinion is that we do not need ideological or political principles to solve offending. We can look at research, allow research to dictate our opinions. Do not take political opinions and ideologies and try to fit them into the explanation of crime. Look at research. That is what's going to tell us what works and what doesn't. Opinions and ideas are great for creating research ideas, but ultimately, if our research doesn't reflect those opinions, we have to change our ideas. We have to change those opinions. The YCJA was brought in to tell judges, no, you cannot use deterrence as a sentencing principle. And that's why you might see this big drop in the number of court cases or the rate of court cases resulting in custody sentences. Because judges were told you can no longer use custody sentences as a crutch or as a default. You can't say that we're just going to deter the kid from committing crime in the future, because we know that doesn't work. Of all the charts that I show in this lecture, I think this one might be the most important for you to understand. It shows the rate of youth charged as well as the rate of youth that experienced diversion. What diversion means is that the youth was kept out of the formal justice system. They did not end up in court, or they were diverted from the formal court process after appearing in front of a judge. They don't want this individual to actually go through the formal court process. And it results in the individual not having an official record for an offense. What we see in this graph is that under the YCJ, the use of diversion increased, the rate of charges decreased. This means that being sort of quote-unquote softer on crime by diverting more youth didn't suddenly tell other youth in the justice system that, hey, it's okay to offend, or you're not going to get in trouble. If you commit crime, you're just going to be diverted, so you might as well go ahead and commit crime anyways. It's showing that we can create these diversionary measures without having a resultant increase in a youth crime rate. Another concern that could have manifested is the idea of net widening. Net widening is where we create these diversionary measures, and that actually has the opposite effect, and it increases the diverted youth's likelihood of having future interactions with the justice system. We did not see charges increase, so we know that diversion did not result in net widening. This graph is meant to help us understand the types of crimes that individuals are more or less likely to commit at different years of age. So the light blue is reflecting youth between ages 12 to 17. The darker blue is reflecting young adults between ages 18 to 24. And the red is reflecting all adults that are age 25 and over. And what you can see here is that youth are especially overrepresented when it comes to committing property crimes. So the crime rate for property crimes is higher for youth compared to adults. But not only look at violent offenses when we're comparing youth to young adults. Young adults are disproportionately responsible for violent crime. This kind of goes against the idea that youth are the more violent individuals, the ones that we need to watch out for because they're more dangerous. What I think is cool or interesting is if you flip this graph around and look at it vertically instead of horizontally, you can actually see for each offense type something that really looks like the age crime curve, that reiterates that at the aggregate level we tend to see across these different crime types an age crime curve effect. What's interesting about this graph is it has some pretty important policy implications for how we would go about preventing youth crime. We can see that for youth, crime tends to peak in the late afternoon. So when they're let out of school, but before maybe their parents are home from work. It reiterates that maybe we need after school programs or things for youth to do. One of the biggest dangers is unstructured free time. They don't have anything in particular to do. This might lead to boredom, which might lead to involvement in criminal offenses. So when thinking about trying to reduce youth crime, we want to think about what are youth doing between the hours of like 2 and 5 p.m. and what can we do to fill up that time? Thinking about Hershey's idea of involvement. They'll be so involved in other pro-social activities, they won't actually have time to go out and commit crime. Here's another really interesting slide that's showing the percent of instances in which a particular crime type had a co-offender based on the age of the individual perpetrating the offense. We can see that youth, regardless of crime type, were much more likely to have a co-offender compared to young adults and compared to adults. So what does this mean for crime rates? I think this is really important from like a stats nerd perspective. We can begin to see that, okay, if a crime rate is reflecting the number of persons involved in crime, we know that the youth crime rate might be higher than the adult crime rate. But if it's 5 youth committing 1 crime, then it's not like youth are actually committing more crime than adults. It's just that youth are more likely to be involved in 1 crime together. So if 1 adult commits 1 crime, but 3 youth are involved in 1 single crime, well then they're responsible for an equal number of crimes. It's not 3 versus 1, it's 1 versus 1. Each event was just 1 crime, but 3 people were attached to the youth crime. So we might be overestimating the rate of youth offending compared to adult offending. So all I'm trying to say here is that maybe when we're looking at crime rates, we're actually overestimating the amount of crime that youth are responsible for. So once again, we know that youth crime is on the decline, but it might even be lower than what we actually measure. All right, the last graph here, straight from your textbook, that's showing the youth aged 12 to 17 accused of a homicide offense. To this point, we were looking at rates. Note that in this graph, the y-axis is just looking at the number of homicide offenses. And this is why I think it's so important to look at long-term trends. I'll get asked by like certain media outlets to respond about how the youth homicide rate in Surrey has doubled between the years 2019 and 2020. And it's such a misleading stat because the youth homicide rate in Surrey, in Burnaby, doesn't matter where, it's so low. We'll have in 2019 maybe 4 youth committed a homicide offense in Burnaby, but in 2020 8 youth committed a homicide offense in Burnaby. The media won't say that there were just 4 more homicides in 2020 compared to 2019. What the media will say is that there was a 200% increase in the number of youth crimes committed or youth homicide offenses committed in Burnaby. Just look at this graph on youth homicide for all of Canada. I think around like 2004 it was about 40 youth homicide offenses, but in 2005 it was around 70 youth homicide offenses. So you know that some people who believe in a get tough on crime approach would say things like, oh look, the youth homicide rate increased by almost 200%. We almost doubled the number of homicide offenses in Canada. But relatively speaking, this is a really small number of homicide offenses. If we look in like places like Chicago in the United States, they have like 200 homicide offenses in a single year. And they're like a third of the population of all of Canada. When we have homicide numbers that are already very low, then small increases and small decreases can look really large in magnitude. We could go from 40 homicide offenses to 20 homicide offenses. Then we'll think, oh, we're doing something great to stop homicide offending in Canada. And I don't know about this because short-term trends might not be all that important. That's why I want to look at long-term trends. And we can see in terms of the long-term trend in Canada that the rate of homicide offending, or the number of homicide offenses, hasn't really changed. In fact, if we take into consideration the rise in Canada's population, maybe we would say that youth homicide offending in Canada has actually declined. So if we look from 2004 to 2005 and 2006, certain people might freak out and say, oh my god, the youth are becoming out of control, they're super predators, we need to really get tough on crime, crack down on crime. But then from 2006 to 2008, we might start cheering and say, oh, we're so marvelous, we reduced the number of homicides almost in half. But basically, it really only came back down to like the mean number of crimes, homicide offenses in Canada over the last 20 or so years. So we just need to be careful about drawing too strong of inferences when looking at youth homicide offending. I think that's enough graphs for now. I think we can now move on to describe a little bit about the nature and course of youth offending. I alluded to this earlier, but only about 1 in 5 crimes in Canada are actually committed by youth. So another way of saying this is that 80% of all offending in Canada is perpetrated by adults. The youth crime rate is higher than the crime rate for adults. But in terms of the actual volume of offending in Canada, adults are involved in more offending. Yet we see in politics especially, there can be this focus on youth crime, that youth crime is out of control. And really, if we wanted to reduce crime, we also have to be focusing heavily on adults. I mentioned the age crime curve is kind of like a universal fact of criminology, and another universal fact is the idea that a vast majority of all crime perpetrated by youth is accounted for by a very small proportion of all youth offenders. And I use the term youth offender just because it's quicker to say, but generally speaking, we want to avoid this sort of stigmatizing language by calling someone an offender. We want to use more person-centered language, so we could talk about a person who is experiencing incarceration, or a person that's been adjudicated. Some might say, well, why do I need to bother doing this? This all sounds kind of silly. And I think the best argument that I've heard made, and what convinced me to really try and use more person-centered language, is the idea of, why would we call someone the thing that we don't want them to become? So if we want someone to stop offending, why would we call them an offender? We're trying to get them to not be that, so why give them that label? What we do know is true is that a very small minority of youth are disproportionately responsible for the majority of all crime. This is what we usually refer to as chronic offending. Another key thing to keep in mind is we saw that the rate of violent offending in Canada for youth has gone down. It's also important to keep in mind that violent offending is typically not very serious. Most youth violence is not like aggravated assault, firearm-related offenses, homicide. It's typically very minor, simple assault. Not to say that assault is suddenly okay, but just to understand that most violence is not serious violence. To put some of this into context, in 2000s, only about 0.2% of all violent offenses by youth were for homicide, whereas 77% of all violent offenses by youth were simple or common assault. We saw some evidence of this earlier, but just to reiterate that youth account for only 40% of all charges for break and enter, about the same amount of charges for arson, and then we can see a lower and lower percent of all crimes that youth are responsible for compared to adults, down to youth being responsible for just 16% of all violent offenses. When youth are committing crime, the type of crime that they're most likely to commit is property crime. And among property crimes, the most common crime type is minor theft, or what we would call theft under $5,000. That's the most common crime type by youth. So it's not as if youth are committing especially serious offenses. That's not to say that youth do not commit serious offenses. When I was doing the interviews in custody, almost all of these youth had histories of violent crime, but they represented less than 1% of the general population. It's very rare for youth in the community to end up in custody. In fact, I think it's about 1 in every 1,000 to 1,500 youth actually end up in custody. So think back to like I went to a very small high school, or only like 90 people in it, but some of the high schools in the Lower Mainland, you're going to have like in your grade alone like 500 people, 1,000 people, and that means that you might not find a single kid in your grade that actually ended up in a youth custody facility. That's how rare incarceration of youth is in British Columbia. The last lecture in this course will touch on this topic in greater detail, but sadly throughout the years Canada has failed to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in custody. In BC, Indigenous youth represent about 5 to 6% of all youth, yet they represent about 25 to 30% of all youth in custody. And this is a statistic that I do want you to memorize for the exam. There are not many things or many statistics that you need to memorize, but one of them that you do need to memorize is that Indigenous youth account for about 25 to 30% of the court population in British Columbia. In places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it's upwards of 50%. Understand this overrepresentation, we have to go back in time and understand the impact of colonization and Canada's attempted genocide against Indigenous peoples. As I mentioned, we'll talk about that in the last week of class. One of the things I'll just mention now is that there are also concerns currently about the over-policing of marginalized groups, especially Indigenous persons. When it comes to over-policing, I'm not saying that what's happening is that police departments are racist. I'm certainly not ruling that out. I believe obviously that their structural racism exists, but what can also happen is we can get this vicious circle where policing agencies might target specific areas that have higher crime rates, and so they will send more police officers to focus on those communities. And having more police officers in specific communities increases the likelihood that crime is going to be detected. So the more that we detect crime, the higher the crime rate becomes, where maybe we just see that the crime rate in one neighborhood is not as high as the crime rate in another neighborhood because police aren't patrolling that other neighborhood as frequently. And so if we look at places like the downtown east side and in East Vancouver, where we might see a more disproportionate representation of Indigenous persons compared to other municipalities in the Lower Mainland, it's the over-policing of these areas that might further continue or perpetuate the cycle of seeing the overrepresentation of Indigenous persons in custody. In week 2, we took a look at the homicide offense against James Bulger committed by Thompson and Venables, and both of those individuals were under the age of 12 at the time they committed their offense. And in Canada, they would not be held criminally responsible because the age of criminal responsibility in Canada is 12. Some politicians and members of the media have called for Canada to lower the age at which individuals are criminally responsible because of the idea or their belief that young persons are before the age of 12 and they know they cannot be punished for their behavior, and that's why they go out and engage in these types of crimes. The reality is that youth offending by kids less than 12 is extremely rare. When it does happen, about 90% of all such youth are boys. The majority are 10 or 11 years old, so it's not like 8, 7, 6-year-olds are out engaging in criminal behavior. And so only like 13% of individuals under the age of 12 are also under the age of 7. And in most cases, for kids less than 12 engaging in crime, their offenses are very petty in nature. They're not particularly serious. So while I believe that someone under the age of 12 can form mens rea, they know what they're doing and understand that what they're doing is wrong, I'm not sure that lowering the age of criminal responsibility would be very useful in reducing Canada's crime rate. It wouldn't really deter kids from engaging in crime to begin with. When it comes to looking at the typical offense profiles for girls compared to boys, we see some similarities. So for both girls and boys, theft under $5,000 is about the most common crime types. And then we can see things like break and enters and sort of property damages also being a little bit more common. Here's something that I think is interesting. When we look at girls, and this is more historical, I don't know if this is going to be true today, but When we looked at girls historically, their violent charges tended to occur early in adolescence, whereas for boys, we saw that their violent charges tend to occur in later adolescence. And I think the reason for this has to do with patriarchal and paternalistic sentencing policies by judges. What I mean by this is that early on, when boys were violent, it would just be viewed as boys being boys. It's okay, it's natural, they'll grow out of it. But if their behavior continued on until age 15, 16, 17, and they're still being violent, then judges might crack down on that behavior. The reverse was seen for girls. For girls, they were being charged with violent offenses earlier because it was really, in the eyes of judges, a severe departure from normative expectations of what girls were supposed to do. Girls weren't supposed to be violent. And because they were fighting against not just other people, but against gender norms, judges were more likely to be punitive towards these girls because they viewed them as like the next Eileen Wuornos, and because their violent behavior at a young age was so shocking, they needed to come up with a particularly serious punishment for these girls. And that's why we see this discrepancy. Ultimately though, the offending patterns of boys tend to be much more severe than the offending patterns of girls. So boys tend to begin to offend at an earlier age. They tend to offend for a longer period of time compared to girls. They are more likely than girls to continue to offend in adulthood. Girls' offenses tend to involve less serious offenses, whereas boys are more likely to engage in more serious crimes. The vast majority of homicides are perpetrated by boys, but when it comes to homicides against family members, girls are more likely to commit such homicides compared to boys. Another theme regarding youth crime in the media is that youth are a danger to seniors or a danger to adults, and that older persons need to fear young and unpredictable youth. But the reality is that when youth commit offenses, the victim is most likely to be another youth. I'm talking specifically about violent offenses. This is what we commonly refer to in criminology as the victim-offender overlap. Most individuals that commit crimes also experience violence victimization. When it comes to youth crime, rarely do they offend against strangers. More likely that both persons know each other. Boys are more likely to be victims of assaults and robberies, whereas girls are more likely to experience sexual victimization. Boys in general have higher violence victimization rates compared to girls, unless we include sexual violence in that definition, and then the victimization rates are fairly similar. Dating violence is more likely to actually be reported by boys compared to girls. Girls who experience dating violence are more likely to experience more severe forms of dating violence compared to boys, but in terms of the strict prevalence, boys are more likely to experience dating violence compared to girls. Administrative offenses refer to a youth's violation of a court order. So if a youth is given probation for a violent offense, and a condition of that probation order is that the individual must abide by a curfew of 9 p.m. or they are to have no contact with the victim or no contact with their co-offender. A violation of that probation order can result in new charges that are brought forward by the court, and especially under the Young Offenders Act, youth were being incarcerated at an unprecedented rate for administrative offenses. I talked about the media as a source of crime information to start the lecture, and that's how I'll kind of finish things today. The media can misrepresent crime in two ways. So first, it can create perceptions that sensational cases are actually more common than they actually are. So think about it, the media very rarely is going to talk about theft under $5,000 or minor property damage. The public tends to only see more severe crimes that can give the impression that severe or serious crime is common. What the media can also do is create this perception that individuals involved in serious crimes are somehow different from individuals involved in common crimes. The reality is that the most serious offenders tend to be involved in a versatile pattern of offending. The individuals involved in homicide offenses and sex offenses tend to not specialize in those crimes. They are also involved in theft and minor assault and minor forms of robbery. The last thing that I'll mention is that sometimes the media just does a really bad job of depicting how the justice system process actually works. And we saw this especially true in the media's reporting of the Luka Gordic homicide that occurred a couple of years ago. Luka was a young teenager celebrating a grad party in Whistler, and he was attacked and killed by 4 young males. And the public had a very understandable outcry because the youth were not being charged as adults. And the media sort of fueled the flames of this by questioning, like, how can Canada not be charging these 4 young persons as adults when it seemed like their crime was premeditated? They had weapons. They attacked this individual because he was sticking up for a young girl who was being insulted by one of them. The public called for a more punitive justice system. The media either purposefully avoided giving the public key information or just failed to do its own due diligence. What I'm referring to here is that Canada's general public was very upset that these offenders were not being charged as adults. They thought that they were going to be charged as youth, and that would mean a less severe punishment. But in Canada, the way our justice system works is that no youth under any circumstance is ever charged as an adult because they have not yet been found guilty. But if a youth has committed a very serious offense, and if they're found guilty of that offense, then Crown Counsel can apply to have the youth sentenced as an adult. So if the youth has been convicted, then they can be sentenced as an adult. And this is exactly what Crown Counsel's intention was. As soon as those 4 individuals were convicted, they were going to ask for adult sentences. The media failed to let the public know about this, and this caused a lot of hurt, a lot of pain amongst family members, friends of the deceased victim. And it's all about the media failing to do their job or to reach out to researchers or Crown Counsel and get an understanding of the justice system process. So often the media just gives us sound bites and doesn't take the time to go into the full story. And that's why we need you, the students studying criminology, to begin to understand how the justice system works so that we can accurately explain it to members of the general public.